my name is Evie and welcome to my first book review. Today I will be reviewing the poetry book All the Ways We Take Up Space by Jillian Rabideau. I sincerely hope that's how you pronounce her name, but if not, I'm very sorry that I've just butchered it. So Jillian is a slam poetry performer. She has a YouTube channel which I will link down below. I personally believe that her poems and the delivery of her poems are phenomenal. She has been doing slam for 4 or 5 years, I think, thereabouts. But this is the first book that she has published, and it consists of both poems from her channel and original and new poems. There's only about 3 or 4 poems from her channel that have made it into the book, but the rest is original poetry, and from my standpoint, it is incredible. I highly recommend this book, and I'm about to gush about it on this channel. So if you're looking for a more analytical, unbiased review, then I'm afraid you're going to have to look elsewhere, because I cannot recommend this poetry book to you enough. This is the book in question. I'm hoping you can see that. I love everything about it. I love the colour scheme. I love the stars, the constellations, the planets, just everything, and the back is equally as stunning. So this is the debut book of Jillian. I'm not even gonna attempt to pronounce her last name because I'll just butcher it. And I have to admit, this is one of the best poetry books I've ever read, hands down. There are multiple elements of it that I loved and I enjoyed, and I'm going to get into all of those now. So the first thing I enjoyed is that it is a poetry book which consists of poetry, which I love poetry books, but if you market a book as something, it should be what you have marketed it as. So some poetry books are marketed as such, but you get them and they're anywhere from 50 to 70% prose, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with prose. It's just, to me personally, if you market a book as a poetry book, the majority of the writing within that book should be poetry. But that's just a personal opinion. So I was incredibly happy that this consisted entirely of poems. And Jillian has what she calls paper poems and slam poetry. So the slam poetry is poems that are to be performed, and the paper poems are, just as they state, poems to be read on paper. But what I loved was that if it weren't for the size difference, I wouldn't have been able to tell which were paper ones and which were to be performed. In fact, just because a poem was smaller doesn't necessarily mean that it's a paper poem. So I'm still not entirely convinced which is which, and I loved that because I think it is a testament to a brilliant writer when you can't differentiate between what is supposed to be performed and what is supposed to be simply on paper. So I loved that. There are 3 main elements to this book. There is with love, with apathy, and just by existing. Just as a warning, a trigger warning to those of you who are dealing with severe mental health or who are dealing with the after effects of sexual assault, you might want to either avoid this book or be careful going into it, because even though it deals with its subject matter incredibly delicately and respectfully and beautifully, it can be quite triggering for those who just a hint of those topics is enough to set them back. So if you are in a place where you want to read something you might be able to relate to, then I highly recommend this book. But if you are in a place where you don't feel you could handle even the mention of those topics, I would avoid them. Style-wise, I think these poems are phenomenally written. I'm going to be saying that a lot throughout this video. Just the way that she crafts words so beautifully and rhythmically, and so the imagery is so intense, and the poems themselves are so impactful. There were poems that I read that I couldn't relate to, but I still felt what they were trying to convey, and I found I could still appreciate them, and that doesn't always happen. Sometimes I read a poem that I can't relate to and feel completely disconnected from it, but in this case, throughout this book, that wasn't true at all. The poems that I felt I could connect to made me really emotional in a good way, and the poems that I weren't able to connect with, I still understood and still held some sort of impact. So I just think that is a phenomenal marking of a writer, to be able to evoke such strong emotion from people who may not be able to necessarily relate to your work. Structure-wise, I also appreciated how each element of the poems, so for example you had love poems, you had poems relating to mental health, sexual assault, retrospective poems, and poems about not death as in grief, but there was a poem about, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, sorry about that, but there was a poem where she mentioned a near-death experience that she'd had and the way it impacted her, and the thoughts with the, sorry I can't seem to speak, the thoughts that went through her mind during that event. And the point that I started off with was that I appreciated how each poem fit into the section that it started this off so good. I appreciated how basically each poem fitted into the section. So the love poems fit with the love section, the apathy poems fit with the apathy section, and so on and so forth. And the reason I appreciated that was because in some books, again, there isn't really a flow or a rhyme or a structure to the poems, which is fine, but it can get a bit confusing if you have love poems on one page and then you have some poems about another topic and then it jumps back to love. That, for me personally, that can be a bit confusing. So I like having a poetry book that is structured so you know, right, okay, these are the topics that are going to be taking place within this section, and those topics are for that section. I have read this book 3 times now, and each time it has really, it's been like reading it for the first time, and that to me is just phenomenal. That I can go back and it not feel, oh, I've read these poems before, I'm bored of this now, is amazing. Granted, I've only had this book for just over a month, but I have a feeling that it's the type of book that I can go back and reread it and reread it and reread it and never get bored. And I just love that about books. Any type of books, but especially this book. So, yeah, this is my gushing review. I'm sorry it hasn't been very analytical. I don't have any criticisms about this book at all. I tend to save criticisms for books that I can find flaws in, and I can't find any flaws in this book at all. You might think differently, so I advise you to go to her channel, watch and listen to some of her poems, decide if they're for you, if they're the type that you'd like. If not, then obviously don't get the book. But yeah, sorry for this kind of rambling, gushing review. It is my first one, so it's not going to be perfect by any means. But I hope you have enjoyed it nonetheless, and I hope you will subscribe and stick around for more.